Chapter 1: The Arrival. It had been weeks in the making, but the group of friends had finally decided on the perfect way to celebrate Max's 25th birthday, a weekend getaway to an old cabin in the woods. The 5 of them had been friends since childhood, and they had been looking forward to this trip for months. As they packed their bags and loaded up the car, they couldn't contain their excitement. Sarah, Max's girlfriend, had put together a playlist of their favorite songs, and they sang along as they drove through the winding roads leading up to the cabin. As they got closer, they started to feel the anticipation building. The cabin was old and eerie-looking, with vines crawling up its walls and a rusty metal roof. The woods around it were dense, and the air was thick with the sound of crickets and rustling leaves. It was the perfect place for a weekend getaway. As they got out of the car, Max took a deep breath of the crisp air and said, "This is going to be an awesome weekend, guys." Sarah smiled and said, "I can't wait to relax and get away from the city." Mark, the joker of the group, added, "As long as there's beer, I'm good." Jenny, the more reserved of the group, looked around nervously and said, "This place gives me the creeps." Tom, the daredevil, laughed and said, "Come on, Jen. It's just an old cabin in the woods. What could go wrong?" As they entered the cabin, they noticed that it was a bit run down, but it had everything they needed for the weekend: a kitchen, a living room, and 3 bedrooms. They quickly settled in and started unpacking. As the night fell, strange things started to happen. The doors slammed shut on their own, the lights flickered, and they heard strange noises coming from the woods. At first, they tried to rationalize these occurrences, blaming it on the wind or animals outside. But soon, they realized that there was something more sinister at play. The tension in the cabin started to build, and the group members started to turn on each other, suspecting that one of them might be responsible for the strange events. Max started to act suspiciously, and he disappeared without a trace. The group started to worry, and they searched the cabin and the surrounding woods for him, but he was nowhere to be found. As they gathered in the living room, they heard a blood-curdling scream coming from outside. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2: The Disappearance. The group of friends rushed outside, their hearts pounding in their chests. The scream had come from deep within the woods, and they knew they had to find Max. As they ran, they heard strange whispers and felt cold fingers brushing against their skin. The trees seemed to twist and contort in front of them, and they felt as if they were being watched by an unseen presence. As they reached the heart of the woods, they found a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a large, twisted tree with gnarled roots that seemed to stretch out for miles. Hanging from one of the branches was a noose, and they could see the silhouette of a figure hanging from it. It was Max. The group was in shock, and they couldn't believe what they were seeing. They approached the tree cautiously, and as they got closer, they noticed that Max's body was covered in strange markings and symbols. Jenny gasped and said, "What kind of sick joke is this?" Mark shook his head and said, "This isn't a joke. Someone did this to Maximum." Sarah fell to her knees and started to cry. Who could have done something like this? Tom, the most level-headed of the group, took charge and said, "We need to get out of here and call the police. We can't stay here any longer." As they made their way back to the cabin, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They could hear footsteps and whispers coming from behind them, and they felt as if they were being followed by an unseen presence. When they finally made it back to the cabin, they locked the doors and windows and huddled together, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The night was long and sleepless, as they tried to come to terms with the fact that their friend was gone. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the cabin, and they started to notice strange things happening around them. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3: Unsettling Discoveries. The next morning, the group woke up to an eerie silence. They could feel the weight of Max's absence, and they were all on edge. They knew they couldn't stay in the cabin any longer, but they also didn't want to leave without finding out what had happened to Max. Tom suggested that they split up and search the surrounding woods for any clues. Jenny and Sarah agreed to stay at the cabin, while Tom and Mark went out to search. As they made their way deeper into the woods, Tom and Mark started to notice strange markings and symbols carved into the trees. They also noticed a strange odor in the air, like something rotten. As they followed the trail, they stumbled upon an old cabin that had been abandoned for years. The door was slightly ajar, and they could hear faint whispers coming from inside. They cautiously made their way inside, and what they found was beyond anything they could have imagined. The cabin was covered in strange symbols and markings, and there was a strange energy in the air. In the center of the room was an old book, bound in leather and covered in strange symbols. Tom picked up the book and started to flip through the pages. The text was written in an ancient language that he couldn't understand, but the illustrations were disturbing. Mark said, "We need to get out of here. This place gives me the creeps." Tom reluctantly agreed, and they made their way back to the cabin to show the others what they had found. When they got back, Jenny and Sarah were nowhere to be found. They searched the cabin and the surrounding area, but there was no sign of the girls. They found a note that read, "We went to look for Maximum. Be back soon." Tom and Mark knew they had to find the girls before it was too late. They gathered their supplies and headed out into the woods, following the trail that Jenny and Sarah had left behind. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4, Into the Unknown. Tom and Mark followed the trail left by Jenny and Sarah deeper into the woods. As they walked, they noticed that the air grew colder and the trees began to twist and contort in strange ways. After walking for what felt like hours, they stumbled upon an old abandoned church. The door was slightly open, and they could hear faint whispers coming from inside. They hesitated for a moment, but the thought of finding their friends pushed them forward. They cautiously made their way inside, and what they found was beyond anything they could have imagined. The church was covered in strange symbols and markings, and there was a strange energy in the air. In the center of the room was a large altar, covered in candles and strange objects. Jenny and Sarah were standing in front of the altar, and they didn't seem to notice Tom and Mark's arrival. They were completely transfixed by the objects on the altar, and they looked like they were in some kind of trance. Tom whispered, "We have to get them out of here." Mark nodded, and they slowly made their way towards the girls. As they got closer, they noticed that the symbols on the objects were the same as the ones they had seen in the old cabin. Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to shake, and the candles on the altar flickered and went out. The girls snapped out of their trance and looked around, confused. A voice echoed through the room, "You shouldn't have come here." They turned to see a figure in a dark cloak standing at the entrance of the church. The figure stepped forward, revealing a pale, skeletal face with glowing red eyes. Tom and Mark were frozen in fear, unable to move. The figure moved closer, and they could feel its icy breath on their skin. Suddenly, the figure lunged forward and grabbed Jenny and Sarah, dragging them towards the altar. Tom and Mark tried to fight back, but the figure was too strong. As they watched in horror, the figure began to chant in a strange language, and the symbols on the objects began to glow with an eerie light. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. As the figure continued to chant, a bright light filled the room, blinding Tom and Mark. When the light dissipated, the figure was gone, and the girls were lying on the ground, unconscious. Tom and Mark rushed to their side, but they were unresponsive. They quickly gathered their things and carried the girls out of the church and back to the cabin. When they arrived back at the cabin, they noticed that the strange symbols and markings from the old cabin and the church had followed them. They were now etched into the walls of the cabin, and the air was thick with a strange energy. Tom and Mark tried everything they could to revive the girls, but nothing worked. As the night grew darker, they heard strange noises coming from outside the cabin. It sounded like something was scratching at the door. They tried to ignore it, but the scratching grew louder and more persistent. Finally, Tom got up and opened the door, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Standing on the porch was the figure in the dark cloak, with its pale, skeletal face and glowing red eyes. It spoke in a voice that seemed to come from beyond the grave, "You should have stayed away." Tom and Mark tried to shut the door, but the figure was too strong. It pushed its way inside, and the air grew colder and darker. The figure floated towards the girls, and they suddenly sat up, their eyes now glowing with the same red light as the figures. They spoke in unison, "We are no longer your friends. We belong to the darkness now." Tom and Mark tried to run, but the cabin was now surrounded by a thick, impenetrable fog. They were trapped. As they huddled together, waiting for their inevitable fate, Tom suddenly remembered the old book they had found in the abandoned cabin. He dug through his bag and pulled it out, hoping it might hold some answers. As he flipped through the pages, he noticed something strange. The symbols in the book were the same as the ones etched into the walls of the cabin. Suddenly, he realized what they had to do. He grabbed Mark's hand and pulled him towards the wall. They began to scratch the symbols into the wood, using the book as a guide. As they worked, the cabin began to shake, and the girls' eyes grew brighter. But Tom and Mark persisted, etching the symbols into the wood with all their might. Finally, the last symbol was complete, and the cabin was filled with a blinding light. When the light dissipated, the girls were lying on the ground, unconscious. Tom and Mark quickly gathered their things and carried the girls outside. As they walked away from the cabin, they heard a faint whisper on the wind, "We will be back." End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. Tom and Mark carried the girls back to their car and drove to the nearest hospital. They were admitted immediately, and the doctors did everything they could to revive them. After several hours, the girls finally woke up, dazed and confused. Tom and Mark explained everything that had happened, but the girls had no memory of the events at the church or the cabin. They all returned home, shaken but grateful to be alive. Tom and Mark tried to put the whole experience behind them, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. A few weeks later, they received a package in the mail. It was the old book they had found in the abandoned cabin. There was a note attached that read, "We will always be watching." Tom and Mark were terrified, but they knew they couldn't ignore the warning. They did some research and found a way to destroy the book, using fire and salt. After they burned the book, they felt a sense of relief, but they still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. They started to notice strange things happening around them, doors opening and closing on their own, strange noises in the middle of the night, and the feeling of being watched. They did some more research and found out that the old church they had visited was once home to a cult that worshipped a dark deity. The cult had been disbanded decades ago, but the members had left behind a legacy of darkness. Tom and Mark realized that the figure they had seen in the church was a manifestation of that dark deity, and they had unwittingly invited it into their lives by visiting the old cabin. They knew they had to do something to protect themselves, so they sought out a local psychic who specialized in spiritual cleansings. The psychic performed a series of rituals and cleansings, and the strange occurrences finally stopped. Tom and Mark never spoke of their experience to anyone, but they knew that they had come dangerously close to something that they couldn't fully comprehend. They vowed to never mess with the dark arts again. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7. Years passed, and Tom and Mark had moved on with their lives. They had families, successful careers, and had left the horrors of their past behind them. One day, while Tom was cleaning out his attic, he stumbled upon a dusty old book. He recognized it immediately. It was the same book that they had burned all those years ago. Tom's heart raced as he flipped through the pages. The book was still intact, despite being burned to ashes. And then he saw it, a note scrawled on the inside cover, in the same handwriting as the note they had received all those years ago. It read, "We knew you couldn't resist. Welcome back." Tom's blood turned to ice as he realized what this meant. They had never destroyed the book, and the cult that had been disbanded years ago was still alive and well. And they had been watching Tom and Mark all along, waiting for the right moment to strike. Tom tried to warn Mark, but it was too late. Mark had already been taken, and Tom knew he was next. He could hear the whispers in the darkness, the same whispers that haunted him all those years ago. He knew he had to act fast. He gathered all the knowledge and experience he had gained over the years and went back to the abandoned cabin, where it all began. Tom spent days preparing, building wards and protections around the cabin. He knew it was only a matter of time before the cult found him, but he was ready. And then it happened. The cult arrived in the dead of night, led by a hooded figure that Tom recognized as the same dark deity they had encountered all those years ago. Tom fought with everything he had, but he knew it was a losing battle. The cult was too powerful, and the dark deity was too strong. And then, just as all hope seemed lost, something miraculous happened. The hooded figure revealed itself to be one of Tom's daughters. She explained that she had discovered the cult's plan to take over the world and had infiltrated their ranks, pretending to be one of them. And she had been waiting for the right moment to strike. With her help, Tom was able to defeat the cult and destroy the book for good. They both knew that the horrors of their past would never truly be gone, but they also knew that they had the strength to face whatever may come. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. Tom and his daughter had destroyed the cult and burned the book, but the memories of the past continued to haunt them. They knew that they needed closure to truly move on. Together, they returned to the cabin, now fully restored and devoid of any dark energy. They sat in front of the fireplace, where they had once burned the book, and talked about everything that had happened. Tom's daughter revealed that she had always known about his past and the horrors he had faced. She admired him for his bravery and strength, and knew that he would always be a hero in her eyes. Tom felt a sense of relief wash over him as he listened to his daughter's words. He had always thought that he had to carry the weight of his past alone, but he now realized that he had people who loved him and cared for him. Together, they decided to leave the cabin and start a new chapter in their lives. As they packed up their belongings and drove away from the cabin, Tom felt a sense of closure that he had never felt before. He knew that the horrors of his past would always be a part of him, but he also knew that he had the strength and support to face anything that may come his way. As they drove away, Tom looked back at the cabin one last time and whispered a silent goodbye. He knew that he was leaving the past behind him, but he would never forget the lessons he had learned and the strength he had gained. End.